Hey y'all, welcome to the Liberationist Lit podcast where the power of storytelling meets the force of social change. I'm your host, Taylor Simon, and in this podcast, we believe in the profound impact of stories. And today I am so pleased to be joined with author, historian Nishant Batsha and to talk about his new book. Hey, welcome
Th-
to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Yes. So, Nishant, can you tell us a little bit about yourself as a writer and a historian?
I guess before I go into that, I love the name of this podcast, Liberationist Lit, not only because I like a good pun, it just got me thinking about books that I had read at a young age that like changed my worldview. And I don't know what the first book you read was that made you think about, big concepts like liberation or anti-capitalism. But for me, I was 14 years old and for some reason bought a copy of Naomi Klein's No Logo. And from then on, I was like, my thinking changed drastically. And it's one of those things that still sticks with me today. So yeah, I just love this idea of literature being this gateway to different kinds of liberation type thinking. But that's just a total aside from your actual question. Your actual question was my background as a historian and writer. So I am actually trained as a historian. I did a PhD in history over at Columbia. And while I was doing it, I realized that I wanted to write more creatively. And there was a few reasons for that. If you ever write about the global south and you go into the archive, you'll find that you can never really access individual lives. You're always sort of at a distance. And there's so many reading strategies that have been developed to help get closer to, the individual act in the global south. I was looking at the 19th century Indian indentured labor migration in the 19th century. So it's like really hard to get close to those laborers. And so I was getting more and more frustrated with the fact that I couldn't access people. I could access concepts. I could access the British Empire very easily. And then I was introduced to this concept called critical fabulation by the amazing writer and thinker Saidiya Hartman, who developed this when she was looking at the histories of slavery, especially on the slave ship. And it's this notion that there is a leap that you can make as a critical thinker where you are essentially, and I'm butchering this, so if anybody knows critical fabulation really well, they're going to get mad. You could essentially make things up, but that making things up is grounded in an entire critical apparatus of like historical knowledge. And so to sort of get close to people, I realized I had to write creatively. And this was how I sort of scratched that itch of really wanting to write about everyday people in extraordinary circumstances. And so that project, started with my first novel. It's continued with the second one. And I often joke that in her Reef lectures for the BBC, Hilary Mantel said something like, she started off as a novelist and discovered she wanted to be a historian. And I think that's really present in her books. You read Wolf Hall and you get very fine historical detail that is accurate. I mean, she did a lot of archival research and really went into the weeds for a lot of things. And in those lectures, she talks about why she gets so detailed. And I think when I was studying history, I realized the opposite. I was a historian and I realized I wanted to be a novelist for those very same reasons that I talked about. And so I think that informs a lot of my work as well, because I am very comfortable with changing names and places and the historical timeline. There's a lot of fudging of facts that occur in my writing. And I think it's because I have this historical base, but I'm willing to depart from it in many ways. Whereas like Hilary Mantel has this novelistic base and she confines it within a very particular kind of history writing.
I think that's so interesting. And to deviate a little bit from the conversation, my awakening story was actually like one of the top banned books across the country sold by Patricia McCormick. I read that in high school and that was the book that really put me in proximity to like, okay, like the world doesn't revolve around me. I have it hard, but like these are things that are actually happening. And that was like the first time a story really catapulted me and started me to thinking about not necessarily um how building empathy, because I was always doing that, but taking that empathy from, okay, I'm put in your shoes right now, but I'm taking the next step further. Okay, now I'm fired up because I connect with you in this way. And now I want to do something for all of our collective liberation. And I think that was the first book that did that for me.
It's an amazing
And
experience as a teenager to not only realize of the vastness of the world outside your existence, but also have this lens into an understanding that you could change it. There are ways in which you could affect this whole great machine that exists outside of us. It's a great feeling, much better than those teenagers who discover like the fountainhead and round and then go down that rabbit hole. So I feel lucky, and for both of us, that we discovered books that weren't that and didn't have to go through that phase, because so many teenagers go through that phase as well.
oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. And now at this rate, we're just going to ban all of the books that make teens feel like they can do something. Like in Lexington County here in South Carolina, which is the neighboring county to where I'm located, they have a parental consent form for the Hunger Games.
Times in
But
which we live.
right, exactly. But something else you were talking about, I think it's so interesting because I remember growing up in learning history, they talked about primary sources like letters and diary entries. And are there are all of these everyday people who they're just documenting their lives, and we use that as primary resources, but there's a lot of power and privilege that come to play. So the when thinking about and researching history around slavery, you're not going to get those accounts because those they weren't even considered people versus people important enough to have their everyday taken as something as powerful as history. And I think that has really speaks to what we're going through now and our stories being silenced and who are the everyday people in extraordinary circumstances living today right now. Are we going to see those people in the future and use those people as primary resources for history in the future? So I think that is a really interesting commentary about power and privilege and
Mhm.
whose experience even gets to be considered history.
Yeah, because for a primary source to be preserved in the moment, it has to be deemed of some importance. People have to keep it. So if you ever write a history of, say, the Civil War, there's tons of documentary evidence from individual soldiers because there was a sort of knowledge that this was a world historical event. We're going to keep everything around it. But, for some everyday colonized folk in a part of the British Empire, who's going to keep that? Maybe you'll get some family histories, but probably not. Literacy rates are not the same as they are in other places, so you have to rely on oral histories. There's a great tradition in writing in the global South that is looking at things like court cases and those kinds of documents and reading that against the grain. So trying to find moments when everyday people enter that archive and then kind of ignoring the sort of like legal language, because that's going to be state power talking, and then trying to figure out what individuals were actually doing. So it becomes a great detective project, but it's not the same as, reading someone's diary and it being right inside their mind and having that intimacy.
And I've been reading an advanced copy of one of my colleagues' books, and she writes a lot about like healing ancestors, but also healing future generations by retelling the stories of our ancestors or personalizing, shaping them as a whole person and not just a colonized person or an enslaved person. And I think that's really interesting in historical fiction. You are using this lane to humanize and make somebody a whole person. And even though they're not here to physically or on this plane or spiritual stuff, feel like the healing that is a way of healing history. So I would love to hear more about your newest book, A Bomb Placed Close to the Heart, and how you are humanizing the people in that experience.
So my next book coming out in July is A Bomb Placed Close to the Heart, and it is set in 1917 between Palo Alto and New York City. Palo Alto was a very different place in 1917, not a single tech company to be, but it is set on the Stanford campus there. And the way in which I came about the story is that when I was in graduate school, I read the remarkable history of these men. They were all men who came from India to the West Coast. Some of them would be on the campuses of Berkeley or Stanford. Some of them would be agricultural laborers, but they formed a revolutionary party. The name of their party literally translated to the Party of Revolution. And they were actively trying to figure out ways to overthrow British power in India. And they were doing that from California. And to me, that was just fascinating because I did not know much of this history at all. And ultimately, it's a history of failure because nothing came of this moment. World War I broke out. They were sort of broken up. Many of them were threatened with deportation. Those who weren't sort of went underground. There was a large court case called the Hindu-German conspiracy trials because to be against the British, which was an ally, meant you were for the Germans. So they were seen as enemy combatants, basically. And so because nothing came out of that history, there's very little to write about it. Now, there are a few historians who have looked at someone's material and found it connections to wider processes. So it's not a whole total history of failure, but I was always intrigued by it. And part of this history, there was this man named M.N. Roy, who was an elder statesman later in his life in the Indian nationalist movement, but he came to California as well. And he came to secure guns from the Germans. He was literally trying to smuggle arms back to India. And it was a very convoluted story, but basically the Germans stood him up. And he ends up sort of marooned in California. And he makes his way down to the Stanford campus from San Francisco. And he meets this woman, Evelyn Trent, and they fall in love. And the moment World War I breaks out and those trials begin, they escape California. They go to New York City. And onwards from there, they'll go to Mexico and they'll found the Communist Party of Mexico. They'll meet Lenin, Trotsky. They become part of the historical record. They then go to Berlin and they have this terrible divorce and complete falling out. And Evelyn goes back to California and she lives a quiet life for the rest of her life. She ends up working at the welfare office in Auburn, California. And in 1962, I want to say, her house burns down just from an accidental fire. So all of her papers were lost. Simultaneously, when Emin Roy sits down to write his memoirs, he doesn't mention her at all. She's completely written out of his life. That's how acrimonious her divorce was. So this person, Evelyn Trent, was written out of history because a lot of material around her was lost. The stuff she published when they were in Mexico and in Berlin still exists, but it's like just a few published papers. And, I think there's been a movement lately to rediscover her. I've been working on this book for years, but last year in Jacobin magazine, a historian said, Evelyn Trent needs more airtime. And I emailed him. It's like, yes, she does. And I'm writing a book. So that to me was super interesting on multiple levels. One, two people from vastly different worlds meeting and falling in love. And then in this sort of powder keg time, developing a notion of who they are, not only for themselves, but on the world stage. That to me was a captivating human story. Another part of it was rescuing someone from history who was forgotten and lost. And so I really wanted to write her story as well to sort of get into her head. And so ultimately inside this book, the characters are fictionalized. Their names in the book are Indra and Cora, but they're based on these actual real life people. And one of the reasons I fictionalized them is because I really wanted to get inside their heads and figure out who they are as people, not only as individuals, but as people who kind of rush into a relationship. They fell in love, but they are now together. And because of historical circumstance, they are glued to each other. And maybe they were a good fit, maybe they weren't, but how are they going to negotiate that? How are they going to negotiate their own ambitions with trying to protect and love the other person in the relationship? So that to me was like a deeply human story that I was really interested in wanting to explore. So it began with this real life historical moment and really turned into, I like to call it a socialist coming of age love story. No, socialist anti-colonial coming of age love story. Because there's all these different things happening in parallel.
I love that. so much. I think that's just such an interesting, like taking something so mundane that happens to people all the time, just people from that trope of, oh, people from different worlds falling in love, but setting it in this backdrop of, you said, them coming to age with all of this historical moment happening in the background and how they are influencing it and how it's influencing their relationship and really just I feel like it's a really good angle to humanize our leaders because we do tend to idolize them. And when we hear about like their flaws, it's like, what do we do now? Well, like, they've fallen off their pedestal. How do we, like, are they still great? Do we cancel them? But just showing that at the end of the day, these are still people and they are flawed, even though they're doing great things for like the global stage. But as people, they may not always get it right, and that's okay. And that's what keeps us human. And I know it can be really difficult. Well, I don't know. Maybe it can be really hopeful exploring history and just seeing how people were build resilience and resisted and seeing how we can take some of that in our current times. But I can also see how it can also be overwhelming in that what you said about like a moment that failed or didn't achieve its goals in the way that we see a win for history. So I can see how that could be a little bit like, oh, another thing on top of everything that's going on now. So I definitely would love to hear what keeps you like grounded in this work as an author and a historian.
I mean, I think what I do is so textual and sort of up here. It's like the top 12 inches of my body are kind of always firing. And I remember when I was doing my fieldwork for graduate school, I was living in Trinidad for about 2 months. And I was really lucky to fall in with a group of authors and poets and artists. And the editor, Nicholas Laughlin, he is a super nice individual. He is a poet and an editor. And we got talking once about the ways in which writers can stay grounded. And I think I mentioned something that I was taking up woodworking just as a little hobby. And he was just like, writers need something that's lightly physical. You need to use the rest of your body. Otherwise, you're too much in here and you're going to lose the train of thought. You're going to lose, connection to the fact that we're writing about people in the world. You're going to spend too much time in your own head. And it stuck with me. That was over a decade ago with that idea that writers need to have a hobby that's lightly physical, not something that's so tiring that you can't go back to your desk and write. So for me right now, my house at Buffalo is 135 years old. Nobody cared for a lot of the parts for it. And I think 50 restoring doorknobs and locks and mortises and doing something that like feels very physical, but also is historically grounded. It's like scratching all these various itches. Like I am taking something from history and making sure it exists in a sort of historical and functional way, making something beautiful, figuring out what needs to go where. So I think if anyone takes anything from this conversation, if you're a writer, find that thing that's slightly physical that gets you away from your desk, out of your head, because I think that keeps you grounded in the work. You could return to the work much fresher when you've done something, you've been in the world a little bit and you're refreshed. So maybe not exactly the answer you're looking for, but that's like, my prescriptive advice for everyone, taking it from Trinidad and broadcasting it around the world.
Oh no, I totally get that because I am all like when you said writers in their head, that is me all the time. And so I do like to run and be outside. That's my one time outside. So definitely adding some physical components and living in your body and experiencing the world. So you're not living so much in your head all the time, which fun place sometimes, but get out and live a little too.
Yeah,
So
it's sometimes maybe too fun. You gotta you gotta take what's a great quote. Oh, as a parent, I sometimes see my role as taking the punch bowl away before the party gets too fun. So you got to do that to yourself too.
yes, definitely. So, has there anything that's really caught your attention that you've been reading lately?
So right now I'm working on my next project. So whenever I'm knee deep in a project, my reading gets really weird because it's just for the sake of that project. So just briefly, this thing I'm working on right now is set right after the Civil War on a Shaker colony in Maine. And it's a soldier so disillusioned by the death that he saw in the war, but also the sort of paucity of Reconstruction that he decides to leave society behind and join the Shakers. But the Shakers at that time, their numbers were only, they were a celibate sect, and their numbers were only supported by the fact that they willingly took in orphans. And so he develops a friendship with an orphan in the Shaker colony. And through the relationship with that child, he's sort of trying to reckon with whether he wants to return back to the world, be part of American society, or whether he's content to really be away from it. And so as a result, I am just reading a lot about the Shakers, but also because I don't know much about it, like Christian theology. So I'm reading a lot of Kierkegaard right now. Like I said, it just the reading gets more and more bizarre and out there. And once I feel like I've read enough, that's the moment I get to start writing. But until that point, it's like, oh, I'm reading the book of Deuteronomy. Oh, I'm reading Kierkegaard. Oh, I'm reading like this Civil War history right now. I'm reading about Reconstruction. So it just becomes everything catches my eye at this moment, but none of it is, I think, interesting to a popular audience. But I am just like knee deep in that right now.
I love that. And again, for me, when I go into research mode, that is definitely a time where I need to take the punch bowl away. It gets fun. I can get stuck in research forever.
It's fun.
So kudos to you for knowing that. Like that's the only thing that's like really stopping me from really doing historical work. Cause I know I would research forever and not write.
You know, it's interesting that you say that because I was reading this interview with Paul Harding after he wrote This Other Eden, and it was like an interview for the Booker Prize or something. And he on in that interview just said, I only read one or two books because I didn't want to get stuck in research and I didn't want the research to influence me. And I found that to be maybe when you like win a Pulitzer Prize, you get to have that sort of bravery and that sort of chutzpah. But I thought that was like, that was a bold way of going about it. Like, I'm going to have a general sense of the historical context, but I'm not going to be wed to it. I'm just going to do my own thing. I thought that was very brave.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. And I'm not that brave yet. So,
I am not either. Don't worry.
and lastly, what advice would you offer listeners who want to make a positive impact in their communities?
There is so the zone has been flooded, so to speak. There's just so much going on right now. It's hard to grab onto a single thing, but the single thing I'm going to grab on right now as a piece of advice is, you know, the arts are under attack right now. In Buffalo, where I live, we have this great literary organization called Just Buffalo, and they bring in authors from all over the US for talks. And they do a lot of activities with high schools in the area or around books and reading. And, you know, they had their NEA funding cut, they had their NEH funding cut. And so they're in a financial crisis right now. And at museums, you have their IMLS funding has been cut. So I think, you know, get involved with your local arts organizations. They need your help right now. They need dollars. They need folks on the ground. You know, there is a budding crisis for the arts. The arts in the United States were already funded in a really piecemeal, paltry way. And that funding is now completely under fire, completely under threat. The rug's been pulled out. So I think, you know, if there's one thing you could do around books and the arts and culture, it's just find your local organizations and ask them how you could support them. It might just be dollars, but it might be, you know, being a boots on the ground type volunteer for them. So they need your help.
Definitely, because all of the things that provide education, access to education, critical thinking, arts are under fire. So do what you can to protect them. And there may not be much we can do for the national things, but definitely looking into the local organizations, statewide organizations, and see how you could support. Awesome piece of advice. Well, thank you so much, Nisha, for being on the podcast. Where can people find you and keep up with you and your work?
I am a little old school. I don't exist on social media or have a newsletter or any of that stuff, but my books are sold at your local bookseller. So please support your local bookseller for both my work and the work of countless authors. And I always love hearing from readers. My email's on my website, nishantbatsha.com. Send me a line if you've got anything to say about this book or the last, or just want to chat. I always love hearing from readers.
And I will link the website in the show notes so you can keep up and send a message of love and light. Thank you so much, Nishant, for being on the podcast. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. And thank you, listeners, for being a part of the Liberation is Lit podcast. If you have stories that you want to share, want to suggest any topics, or just want to connect with us, you can find us on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok at Liberation is Lit, or visit our website at liberationislit.com. If you enjoyed the episode, please consider leaving a review. And remember, your voice matters. And together, through the lens of stories, we're going to make a difference in the world. Until next time.